Hello, I'm Nick from Story Productions. We are a production services company based in Sao Paulo in Brazil, and we help international productions to happen here. We assist productions from news to corporate films to feature films with research, logistics, crewing, casting, and post-production. We have just assisted a news crew from ITN who have been over to film the COVID story in Brazil. For this mission, we provided research, access, fixing services in general, and logistics. Today, I would like to welcome Rob Turner, staff cameraman at ITN. Also on this call is Reese Ewing, our COVID correspondent. Now, Rob, thank you so much for granting us this interview. We have just watched the beautiful image you filmed and cut. Very simply, Rob, tell us what you are doing in Brazil. Tell us everything and how your shoot went.
Right, okay, so happy to be joining you guys. My name's Rob Turner, and I'm a cameraman for a British television news organisation called ITV News. And we've been, like every other media organisation around the world, been consumed by covering the coronavirus pandemic. I've spent a lot of time filming in the UK while we've been unable to travel, been in and out of various hospitals and intensive care units in the UK. So I've sort of built up some experience in getting in and out of the protective equipment and making sure that we're operating safely. I've had sort of a lot of practice. There are some cameramen that, or camera operators that don't want to do that kind of work, so the few of us that are stupid enough to agree to do it are the ones that get asked to do more of it. And so after the restrictions in Europe started lifting a little bit to give us a little bit more freedom to travel again, we went to Italy. So we were in Bergamo in the north of Italy, which was very badly hit by the coronavirus, and people would sort of credit that with being the European ground zero. So we went there and did some filming around the situation improving and going into hospital and seeing their intensive care units and seeing how much better the situation was. And then while I was in Italy, the situation in Brazil had started to develop, and the curve here is still on the way up, with the various political angles as well. Whether or not Brazil should have locked down earlier, whether they had enough healthcare facilities, whether or not they had enough medical equipment and medication to be able to treat the population. So it became a very interesting story for us to come and cover. So I got back from Italy very late, and 6 hours later I was back at Heathrow Airport on my way out to Sao Paulo via a 9-hour stopover in Amsterdam, because at the moment nothing's simple. All the usual flight routes aren't available, so we got here as best we could, and then we did some filming in and around Sao Paulo, in some of the communities there, and we went to one of the cemeteries and produced a strong report from there. And then from Sao Paulo we came over to Rio and did a 2 days shoot and a day's edit, and yesterday we broadcast almost 4-minute news report for a special program, and a live from the roof of the hotel with the Copacabana in the background. So that's what we've done.
So did you, I mean, you've only been here a few days, but any outstanding differences you noticed between Italy and Brazil in terms of the disease spread?
Well, I suspect the main differences are in how the countries were locked down. In that Italy went through a very strict lockdown, and although we've seen lots of businesses that have been closed here, there's still a lot of people on the streets. There are still a lot of people moving around. The economic argument here is quite different in that people need to work to survive without, I know there have been some financial provisions given to citizens here. But in Italy, you know, mortgage payments have been put on hold, rent payments been put on hold, people's jobs have been protected by law. So people were able to lock down, stay at home, stay away from other people more easily and still be able to, you know, survive financially. So I suspect the main difference has been how the countries have locked down. Another thing that's been strikingly different here is that there appears to be very little testing and tracing of confirmed cases. We filmed at a testing centre in Sao Paulo, and they weren't actually performing tests. They were taking a temperature, taking the oxygen saturation levels, and making diagnosis on that. So I think it's probably very difficult to control the virus when you don't know where it is. And sadly, I suspect that there's still a long way for Brazil to go before they hit the top of the curve.
Rob, I would like to rewind away from this coronavirus pandemic a bit. Very much like your style of shooting in your report, I'm interested to know more about the man behind the camera. Tell us how you became a shoot edit cameraman, your journey, and tell us about your shooting style.
So if I start back at the beginning, you know, as a kid, my dad came home with a video camera back in the sort of late 80s, and ever since then I knew that that's exactly what I wanted to do. Went through college, went through a training process at the local TV stations in the UK, and then progressed onto the national network station. I've been very lucky to travel a lot with work, and you know, I think if you love what you do, if your job is your passion, then it makes it very easy. I spend all my spare time driving my wife insane, you know, looking into new cameras, new lenses, new techniques. Kind of, you know, if you love it, you do it all the time. And I think a lot of camera operators who feel it's their vocation are the ones that sort of really get on and do well. But as far as my shooting style goes, ITV News is one of the people that I work for. I do a lot of documentary stuff and travel documentary stuff. I've you know, done some commercial stuff, and I'm a Steadicam operator by trade. So I've done a feature film in New York as a Steadicam operator when I was based in America for a few years. So I've been able to have a sort of very wide ranging set of projects, and to be able to bring styles from drama into you know, factual programming is a passion of mine. I strongly believe that the audience that watches the news and watches our documentaries deserve the same production value as they're used to seeing in other program formats. So I like to do a lot of movement camera stuff. I wasn't able to travel with my Steadicam this time, but I use Steadicams as frequently in news and documentary stuff as other productions would use in a drama or a feature film. So a lot of slick, polished production value. And I guess the difficult thing is when you're doing news and documentaries, you don't have so much time to set up. You have to react very quickly to things. So the skill for me is to be able to bring the high production value to a very fast turnaround. You know, we very rarely get to shoot raw or log because we don't have the time in post-production. So I've recently upgraded to this, which is my baby behind me, which is an FX9, and the pictures kind of straight out of the box look very, very, very good without having to go through a grading process. I like to shoot almost exclusively with prime lenses because I like the very fast nature, the shallow depth of field, using focus to help tell the story rather than just the framing, you know, to be able to draw attention to different parts of the picture with depth of field and focus. It's not always possible in, you know, so when you're wrapped up in your full PPE with goggles on and your FFP3 mask and the full suit. You can't in a hospital in a contaminated environment. You can't be changing out prime lenses all the time because you can't touch anything. You can't carry things with you. So I've been using recently a lot a zoom lens, which is something that I've tried to stay away from for a long time. So it's been a challenge in using a slower lens where the focus properties are very different and the characteristics of the lens are very different, but you need to be very reactive in those situations. It would be almost impossible to get the breadth of shots required to put together a sequence with a prime lens in a situation like that. So wherever I can, I'm shooting sort of wide open with prime lenses, but if I have to in a reactive environment, then zoom lenses go on. The FX9's Sony FX9 is a fantastic new camera with its full frame sensor. So even with slower f4 lenses, it's still, you know, the depth of field and the picture is still very nice. I moved from and tell me if I'm getting too technical, but I moved from a Sony F5, which is more their cinema-based range of cameras, and it was a sort of tough decision to move what felt like a step down, but some of the features on the FX9 are just incredible, really, for the price point. It's a great camera.
Can you tell me more about the lens challenge in your recent shoots? You mentioned you like to use prime lenses in general. What informed your decisions on this project?
In the hospital, from our last piece, yes, that had to be a zoom lens because you couldn't keep changing lenses. But for the rest of the filming in the piece, when we're around about outside in the favelas and the interviews and things, I generally try and always use prime lenses. I very much like shooting wide with a narrow depth of field, so that the background's blown out, so that you're focused on the people that are talking. You know, you can direct the viewer's eyes with the focus. So I have a bag full of prime lenses that you know, our fixer and producer kindly carry around for me when we're on a shoot. So I've got a 24mm 35, 85, 135 and a 14mm prime, and these are all these cine primes, which are great because, as you know, they're very fast. So they're all T 1.5, which is, you know, incredibly fast lenses, which is great, you know, in low light. It's great when it's bright because, you know, you can still put in enough neutral density to keep the lenses wide open. And so there's just a lot of switching and changing of lenses all the time, and it's something that typically, I guess, in news particularly, there isn't time to do, but I feel quite strongly that a news audience shouldn't be seeing anything less polished or produced than they're used to seeing in the rest of the TV schedule. I think part of keeping our viewers engaged in what we do is making sure that the imagery is telling as much of the story as the journalist.
Tell me about the process of one of the key challenges you have on the news is capturing the images and then editing. So tell us about the shoot and the edit part, please.
Yeah, so once upon a time, editing on the road was very difficult. You had to carry around a massive number of flight cases with, you know, Betamax and Digibeta players and controllers and monitors and all sorts. Whereas now, obviously, we're just carrying around a MacBook Pro. I edit on Avid, and so we shot for 2 days. And as a team over here, we've got, there's myself, the correspondent, our producer from London, and then we have a local fixer working with us, a translator, and somebody from security. So as a team, as we're moving around, we're constantly planning, okay, well, this is how we're going to start the piece, and then maybe that'll come through to this, and then maybe then we'll see the interview, but now we're going to need some shots to join that together. So there's a constant planning process during the shoot, because, you know, normally in other productions you will get a long time. You know, you may go out and film 10 hours of material, and then you've got 2 weeks to sit down and work out how to join it together. Whereas we're having to streamline that process with news and be constantly talking about, you know, what we need, how it's going to go together, you know, what flows onto this. The correspondent is working out what they want to say, you know, journalistically. I'm trying to work out how we tell the story with the pictures to illustrate the journalism. So I guess in this job, I'm as much of a journalist as the correspondent. It's just they're thinking of the words, and I'm trying to tell the story with the pictures. And so we film for 2 days, which is, that's very fortunate. Often we'll film something and then edit the same day. The nature of news is you don't often get long before a story's out of date. We're very fortunate with this story this time that we had 2 full days of filming and then a day to edit. So we sat down yesterday afternoon to start putting it together, and actually it was a very easy process because we've been talking the whole time we're on the shoot, so we knew where we were starting. I'll lay down some shots in a sequence and say, I think these are the shots we should be using at this point in the film to illustrate, and the correspondent might say, yeah, I agree, but can we switch the order of the shots because I want to say this first and then I need to make that point. So the words and the pictures have to sort of marry together the whole way along. And then when we finished the edit, you know, once upon a time it was satellite trucks and local TV stations to go and feed back to London, whereas now we can compress it and send it straight from the laptop into London, and it was on air in the UK to probably 5 million viewers half an hour later.
Hey, let me follow up on that question. You've basically talked about mostly news reporting, so how do you think what you're describing, the modifications and technological advancements that have helped you through COVID, are going to spill over into like non-news shooting, like documentary or advertising, anything like that? What do you see as coming down the pipe?
Well, I suspect from a news point of view, you know, when everybody was locked down, there were a lot of Skype interviews, a lot of Zoom interviews, a lot of material coming into the building without cameramen going out. So, you know, as a cameraman, that's slightly frustrating, you know, that all these things are arriving on air without requiring any of our skill sets to do it. I think there was a time limit for that. I think people appreciated that was how it had to be for a short amount of time, but I think it's quite a tiresome thing for the viewers to watch continuously. So I suspect that whole Zoom, Skype culture will have a slight hangover in that, you know, it's been made more acceptable that interviews can be done in that way if there's no other way to do it. But fortunately it's come back, and the crews are out there and filming more and more and more. I suspect in going forward that it will mean there's less travel, and that actually people will stay in country more, not exclusively, but it may mean that, you know, companies have to reassess whether or not it's worth the risk to them of sending their own crew, and if there's a talent base in the country that they want to go and film in, that perhaps they're using a local talent, and then the material being sent back, because obviously with the increasing availability of sending very good resolution images over IP, the need for people to be in country to film documentaries and dramas, I suspect, will decrease slightly. But you know, it's so hard to tell. As with all these things, we think that it's going to have a massive dramatic effect. I'm sure COVID is going to leave us in a very different world on the other side of it. But I think we'll also be amazed how many things stay the same.
I noticed someone mentioned, maybe Fred or one of the other reporters, that you got tested. You did testing, right? How did that go? Personal testing.
I'd been tested, or?
Yeah.
So yeah, I'd been filming in and around London, trying to illustrate how COVID could be passed on when this story was still, the pandemic was still in its infancy. So I was in and around London. I was filming on the Tube. I was filming at all the sort of packed places, trying to show people, illustrate how contact with each other, members of the public, were going to pass the coronavirus on. And so in early March, I came down with a, sorry, 1 second. I'm just getting another call. So sorry to pick up. So I'd been filming around lots of crowded areas in London at the start of the pandemic, and very shortly after that came down very ill, sick at home with sort of very textbook symptoms, with shortness of breath and fatigue and all those things. And I was sort of in bed for a week, and I was convinced, absolutely convinced, that I'd had coronavirus. It was a miserable time. And then when I recovered, I was able to go out, and I started then filming in the hospitals and things, sort of in the back of my mind thinking, well, maybe I've had this, maybe I'm sort of protected, but still obviously being safe and taking all the right precautions, but just feeling like I'd had it, giving me that sort of slight confidence that I could go into these difficult situations. So then there is no testing really in the UK for the antibody. You know, you can be tested at the time, although because it was early March, in the UK, there was still no testing at that point. So fast forward, and we get to go to Italy to do some filming. And in Italy, antibody testing is widespread. And for €50, you can walk into a clinic and have some blood taken and get tested. So we all took the opportunity to go and do that. And there was a sort of very, shall we say, her bedside manner was lacking. The nurse that took our blood, as she scratched around in my arm to take some blood out, and then 2 days later we got the results, and lo and behold, I've got 0 antibodies and negative all round. And you know, a lot of people that think they've had this probably haven't, and this is why testing is so crucial.
That leads into another question. Do you notice when you're on longer events that you feel this urge? Because I mean, as Nick said earlier, it's not like shooting in a war zone, right, where you see the bullets flying around and hear them. It's sort of invisible. You might feel like, you know, just you let your guard down. How do you stay diligent?
Yeah, I have done a lot of war zone coverage as well, and I think it's a very similar situation. When you go out to a war zone, the first few days, you're very cautious. You know, you're wearing your flak and your helmet for the whole time, and then by the time you've been out there a few days, incident free, you know, all of a sudden you're taking a shot and you realise you've left your helmet in the van, or you may not stop to think before you drive around a corner about what might be there, and you get a bit relaxed. And that's part of the skill, is to try and stay vigilant, diligent in your safety processes. And actually, I feel like coronavirus is a very similar thing to cover. You take the right precautions, you've had the training, you're making sure when you're going into a hospital, when there's a known virus there, all of a sudden you suit up and you do it properly, and your brain is fully focused on staying safe. But then you'll go out into filming, and we film in the community, in the favelas, and arguably you're almost at risk there, but you're walking around with a different level of protection. So as a team, we're reminding each other all the time, you know, hands being the main thing, not touching your face, staying clean, keeping a mask on, constantly assessing. We also are lucky enough, because we're a large enough organisation, that they make sure that we're looked after, and we have a security and safety person with us, and the person we've been using in Brazil is also very knowledgeable on infectious diseases and protection. So he's been reminding us, handing out the hand gel, make sure you've got your mask on, you know, wiping down the equipment. I guess in the hospital as well, the first few times that I went to a hospital in the UK, it was a very steep learning curve, because none of us really. I mean, there's been Ebola and other diseases that have been covered, but not necessarily domestically for us in the UK. So the skill set probably wasn't there to protect yourself from these things. So it was a learning curve on how to use the protective equipment, how to get in and out of a suit, and then the camera. There were a lot of decisions that we made on what was the best way to take a camera into these sort of dirty areas. Do we put a rain jacket on it so that then the rain jacket's the thing that's contaminated and that then gets washed? Or, already because you're in a PPE mask and goggles or a visor, it's already difficult to film. And the rain jacket means that the camera's not as accessible. So there were the trade-offs. So we decided, when we're in these sort of very contaminated areas, to take the camera as is, do it handheld as much as possible, limit the amount of equipment that goes into the contaminated areas, limit the amount of people that go into the contaminated areas. And then when you come out, getting out of the suit is as important as putting it on correctly. You roll yourself out of it. You don't touch the outside of it. You keep on the inside. Your mask comes right away from your face and off. Your protective eyewear comes away, and then it's sanitized. And then the camera, in the first hospital I filmed in, I got some medical wipes, some stereo wipes, and gave it a quick wipe over and thought that was sufficient. And the chief surgeon at the hospital said, you really should spend a bit more time cleaning that, because that's just been in somewhere really dirty too. So I've got into the routine of in contaminated areas. It takes about 20 minutes to clean down the camera and the tripod. And you go around every little bit, every tiny area and crack where the virus could settle, and wipe it down.
Before your arrival in Brazil, Story Productions did some research and worked on access for you. Could you tell us about your involvement on the pre-production side to prepare for this story?
Do you know, Nick, I'm not sure I'm going to be able to give you a good answer on that, but because I am booked from job to job to job to job. So I was in Italy with one team and was told, you're going to Brazil on this date and this time, and all I needed to know was my flight number, which terminal, and what time it left. And then I come over here, and then once I'm on location, then as a team we sit down and talk about the story that we're going to cover, the elements that we're going to cover, because I can't just turn up and film something, because as I explained, we're as the camera operator, we're as much a part of the journalism in the storytelling as the correspondent. So when we get there, I need to know what I'm doing, but I've been had job after job after job. So to be able to spend time in setting up or researching or looking into what we're going to do, I simply don't have time, and we have a good range of producers that set all of this up for us. So it's only really once I got onto location that we sit down and talk about the content.
So we engaged in a team effort, really. Your producer got in touch with us while you were shooting in Italy. We researched a few possible stories in various cities in Brazil. In this project, there was a lot of preparation and consideration regarding crew security. The spread of the virus in Brazil has affected regions differently, and the response to it has been devolved and coordinated at state and municipal level. And you ended up in Sao Paulo and Rio. Could you tell us about the difference in experience between Sao Paulo and Rio?
The difference?
Yes.
I think one thing I can talk to you about on the preparation that I was involved in was the risk assessment. And we had to be sure that when we're coming to Brazil, that if one of the team members came ill from corona or even an accident, that we were still able to get reasonable healthcare, because obviously the system here is running almost at capacity. So we had to be sure that anywhere we travelled, we had access to an appropriate hospital, and that actually dictated that we didn't go to Manaus. So we couldn't guarantee the team's safety down there from a medical point of view. So as a company, actually, it was decided within the management that it wasn't safe for us to travel down and do that, that we wouldn't be adequately covered with healthcare. So that was a shame, because it was a good story to tell, and something that, you know, our viewers and the rest of the world need to see. But we couldn't do that. But on your question about the differences between Sao Paulo and Rio, I think, apart from the amazing coastline and you know, sunshine, the two places do seem to be approaching things slightly differently. The lockdown being the most visible thing is different. The roads were very busy in Sao Paulo. It seemed like a lot of life was carrying on as normal. We were able to sort of eat in restaurants, not necessarily restaurants, but eat in the hotel and get food while we were out and about filming. In Rio, there were, when we arrived, many fewer restaurants or places to eat. There are fewer people on the street. The beaches are deserted. It's only really when you then get to the favelas, where the economic pressures are greater on the community, that life is still going on more as normal. But it is quieter in Rio. It seems to be more locked down, with more people staying at home here.
As when you're covering news, you want to sort of, at least if you're not like a network like Fox or CNN International, where you're putting forth an actual perspective or argument, as opposed to a balanced presentation of what you consider to be roughly the conditions on the ground that anyone can empirically see. How do you, as a cameraman, you've said already in the interview that you sort of see yourself working hand in hand with the text and the reporters. How do you keep yourself balanced in what you select and how you present things? You know, because you can show a person weeping and crying, very emotional things, but it may not reflect you know, what you're seeing 80% of the time or 90% of the time. It's just something you picked out because it's emotive. How do you stay balanced and present the presentation?
No, I think that's a great question. And having been based out in the States, I saw firsthand what biased media can do, you know, whether it's Fox in one direction, CNN, NBC in the other directions. In the UK, we're very strictly bound by our broadcasting regulations that we have to remain impartial. So actually, culturally, even just growing up, absorbing the media, you know, we're encouraged to have the facts presented to us and to make our own mind up. So it doesn't feel like an alien concept to me once I then got into the industry, that I had to present all sides of the argument and give our viewers the respect enough to make their own mind up of what the story is. So, you know, we covered political campaigns, and we have to make sure that each political party gets a fair representation, an equal amount of coverage through the campaigns. So then when you step over from a very political story into a very human story, with something like coronavirus, yes, how governments are helping their population get through it is obviously going to be part of the story. But we mustn't lose sight of the fact that the main part of our story is how the people are coping, you know, how they feel, what their suffering is. So we have to make sure that we're capturing all sides of the story. And I think in our second report, we filmed a protest down on the Copacabana with pro and anti-government. So if you watch the piece back, you'll see that although on the street, the gathering of anti-government was a much smaller group than the pro-government protest, we had to make sure we showed both sides. So we fairly represented in our material what we saw. So there was a smaller group of antique, so they had that represented within the piece, and then we had other shots of the pro government. So we have to show. Now, as a cameraman, I could have filmed that in a very different way. I could have found 4 people off on their own and taken a shot of them to show a crowd of one size, and then I could have made the protest look like it was, you know, entirely the other way around by the numbers of supporters for each side of the debate. So we have to make sure that we're fairly representing what we see in front of us. And yes, if there is somebody emotional, then you know, that's a powerful image, but we have to make sure that we're using that to represent the fact that we're trying to make, rather than read into that emotion something that isn't there.
Follow up on the question from Reese. Tell us about the graphic choices you make when you use when you film, the lenses you use, the tilt of the camera, how you use the lenses to tell the story you want to convey.
So I guess my shooting style, I like it to be quite intimate. I want to get into a moment. I want to arrive in a situation and look for those moments, look for the image that tells the story, that supports what we're seeing, that sums up the scene in front of us. So I wanted to, in the last piece, when we did the protest, for example, you know, you want to show the power and the, you want to show the power and the force that the police and the military on the ground have got. So, you know, to show them in a long line, they're organized, they're the authority, you know, so you have to present that. You know, it's unusual. Most police officers in the UK don't carry weapons with them. So to our audience, they learn something. If I see that one of the police officers has got a shotgun in their hand, that tells our audience that this isn't quite the same type of environment that they, each side of the protest, there's some audio to support the point that they were making. And the anti-government protest was very static, very dark colours. They're holding a banner, very sort of still in the way they protest. On the other side, the pro-government protest was bright Brazil colours and flags waving and jumping up and down and cheering. So the two, if you look, and we have to do it in a very concise way because we maybe only had 20 seconds to give all of that nuanced information. But if you look at the shots, it very fairly represents each side. And how you frame something, whether you frame something very, you know, if it's a small crowd and you shoot it on a very wide lens, it looks like a really small crowd. You know, whereas if it's a small crowd and you go in and you fill the frame with those people, then it looks busier. So as a cameraman, there's a responsibility to make sure that the frame size that you're using fairly represents the scene that was in front of you when you arrived.
Did you manage that the drone shot of the cemetery? I think it was
Yes.
in the piece I saw yesterday. That was a good shot.
Yeah, I mean, there's no way you could capture something like that from the ground. And the fact that we could see the city, it placed it, says it was in Brazil, it gave it some scale, and the shot developed to show masses and masses of freshly dug graves. And that's not something our audience would have been used to seeing. That's sort of quite a breathtaking image. You know, it's not something we do in the UK. A grave is dug and then it's filled. You know, whereas they're obviously preparing for people to be buried, you know, one after the other.
In this project, you encounter some very sensitive moments. Tell us about how it is to cover a very sensitive story about people, about loss, about tragedy.
So in my career, I've been lucky enough to film lots of different subject matter, and with it being news, often they're not good news stories. You know, it's a war zone or a natural disaster or a pandemic, and I think if I let every image I'd ever seen soak into my subconscious too deeply, I'd be insane by now. You know, I wouldn't be able to get out of bed in the morning. It seems as part of our responsibility to show the world what's happening, we have to put ourselves in some very emotionally difficult or visually disturbing situations. And I suspect what I've done to cope with that over the years is I use the viewfinder to sanitize what I'm seeing. So when I'm in these situations, whether it be a temporary mortuary in a war zone, which can be very disturbing places to see, you know, and or in hospitals here where people are obviously uncomfortable and suffering and struggling and clinging onto their own lives, which is, you know, if you dwelled on that too much, you'd be sort of unable to do your job. So I suspect what I do is I use the viewfinder to sanitize where I am in that moment. I'm concentrating and thinking about getting the shot, and as I'm looking through the viewfinder, it's more like one step removed from reality. It's more like watching those images on a TV, and it is difficult, and it does take its toll on the team being in difficult places. But we have to remember that, you know, that's our job. We're going in there to tell the story, and our suffering in seeing those people pales into insignificance over the suffering that the people we're filming are actually going through.
Thank you so much for your time, Rob. Now, this is it for this video. We will have another video where we will focus on the kit that Rob is using to cover this coronavirus pandemic. Thank you, Rob. We hope this helps. And don't forget, if you want to shoot in Brazil, get in touch with us, Story Productions, your local team in Brazil.